AI to your apps and workflows. Obviously, AI is all over the internet these days, and everyone's trying to figure out how to best use it and utilize it. And so you can definitely use large language models and all those sorts of things inside of Retool. And so we want to just give folks a little bit of an insight into how to do that. So I am going to go ahead and share my screen real quick. The first thing I wanted to mention as we get going here is we do have this post over on our Retool community. Y'all don't need to follow the come join us link because you're already here joining us, but this is where we'll post a link to the recording. And also if there are any questions that we don't get to a chance to answer as part of the Q&A, you can jump in here in our community and post those there. And I'll make sure to get to those over the next couple days. So that's here on our community page, and we'll drop a link to that in the chat so folks can find that. The second thing that I want to mention that's probably interesting to some folks here is we recently released what we're calling our State of AI report. And basically, we surveyed about 750 people in the tech industry, leaders, individual contributors, all that sort of thing. We asked them a ton of questions, and our data and content team put together these really cool visualizations for some of the information that we found. Things like, how do you feel? Is AI underrated, fairly rated, overrated, et cetera? So this is a really great kind of resource to just kind of gut check like how you're feeling about AI, how your organization's using it, kind of what the state of the industry is on this sort of stuff. This is kind of my favorite statistic here is that 27.6% of the people we talk to are still using AI secretly at work. And we dug a little deeper, and there's a few different reasons for that. But if that's you, hopefully that's maybe a little comforting and maybe some evidence to bring to your organization to help make your AI policy more clear, things like that. So there's a ton of data in here that's helpful to folks. Hopefully we'll drop a link to that in the chat as well. Cool. So let's do some demos. This is a build along after all. So I hope you all are here to watch us build some stuff. The first thing we're going to do is take a look at how kind of PDFs and parsing that sort of data work inside of Retool. So for this, I was browsing around the internet the other day, and I found this absolutely insane apartment in New York where I am visiting the Retool office this week. It is currently for sale, if anyone has the budget for this, for $195 million. And so I started thinking about, this is a really cool place. Like if I was the real estate agent selling this, like how would I use a large language model, or how could I use some sort of AI tool to help me do my job better? Because there's a lot here. This is a very long page. There's a ton in this listing description, obviously. And how would I be able to do that? So what I did was took this web page and basically exported it as a PDF. And now that it's a PDF, we can build a Retool app that will allow us to upload that PDF, get some basic information about it, and then ask some more questions about it. So let's do that. So if we jump over here into our Retool app canvas, we can just add a few components that we will need. So the first thing we'll need is just a place to actually drop our PDF file. So we can get our file drop zone component, and we can just give it a different label, so we know kind of what we're doing here. Now that we have that, we want to basically say that once we drop a PDF here, we need some sort of action to be taken, right? So that's where event handlers come into play in Retool. Once you have the component selected, you see you have a bunch of different options over here. Since we want to be able to upload multiple PDFs and have them like replace each other, we won't append files here. But when we scroll down, like I said, we see we have this event handler section. So really what we want to do is when a file is uploaded and this component parses it, we want it to be able to control a query. This is where our AI logic will come in. So we'll come back to that in a minute. But if we go over here and we create a new query, we can use what's called an AI action. And this is where AI starts to get used inside of Retool. So we have a few different actions that we already kind of predefined for you. So these are kind of common things that we see folks wanting to do. Generating text, summarizing text, classifying text. And we have some stuff on the back end that helps make these outputs even a little bit more effective. But what we want to do here is convert a document to text. So we have our PDF and we really just want to convert it to text, because once it's in a text-based form, we can use that in further kind of AI actions to do what we want to do. And we also want to say, hey, this is coming from the file drop zone. That's where the file is that we are going to be looking at. So we can save that. We'll give this a little bit of a more human readable name so that kind of just quickly looking at it, we can see what that's doing. And so it's going to parse our PDF. So now that we have that query, we can go back to our drop zone and say in our event handlers here that we really want to parse PDF and we want to trigger it. So as soon as the PDF is uploaded here and available for use, basically, we want to trigger our query that we have here so that it can transform it into data. So it's always helpful when you're building stuff like this to kind of have these midway checkpoints just to make sure that the thing you're building is actually working. So let's just do that real quick. We can go over here and grab a text component. And really what we want to make sure is that just once our PDF is uploaded, that it's being parsed into text correctly. So what we can do is anywhere you use these double curly braces inside of Retool, you can reference the values of other components or queries as well. So you can see that it already auto-filled our parse PDF, and we can just ask it to output, the data from our parse PDF query, right? So what this will be is just this text box in real time will be whatever the output of our AI query that we created was. So again, this won't last for long in our application, but it's a good way just to make sure that our query is running correctly. So with that relatively basic test set up, let's go ahead and grab our PDF of our listing and drop it here. And you can see we automatically get that like loading indicator telling us that the parse PDF query is running. Now, it looks like it didn't output any data. So we're going to do a quick check and figure out why that is the case. The data is there. It looks like it's giving it to us as an array, in which case we just need to do parse PDF data 0. Perfect. So this is basically the raw kind of data dump of it ingested our entire PDF, which we had generated from that listing web page. And so it has all of the stats that were up at the top of the page. It has that long description that we saw. It didn't parse all of the objects correctly, it looks like. But most of our data is in here and in a text form that we can now use to do some of the other AI stuff that we want to do. So that's great. We can kind of delete this debugging component for now. But let's say that on the side here, we do want a kind of just a summary of the listing so that whenever you upload a PDF, basically it just generates a nice little summary you can use. So let's do this here. We can just say we want this to be a listing summary. And then again, just like we had before, we want it to have some text down here, which we will do in a second. So because we don't want to output all of the text that we just saw, what we want to do is create another query. It's going to be an AI action as well. We'll call this summarize listing. And we do in this case want it to generate some text. And so what we will say here is generate a summary for the following real estate listing. This summary should be a couple paragraphs and highlight key listing data that a prospective buyer should be interested in, maybe would be interested in. Cool. So that's just our input. And then what we need to do is actually give it the data that we parsed out of the PDF, right? So we can just say that's parse PDF.data. And you can see here that it actually then it gives you kind of a preview, so you can tell that, like, yes, your data truly is included in here. Great. So if you want to give it a system message, you can do that as well. This would be a place to say, like, you as the language model are a real estate expert who knows what's important to buyers and what's not. We'll leave that blank for now. Temperature we can leave as is. And we're going to use GPT-4o. This is one of the cool things about all of Retool's AI components is that you can use any of the models that you have connected from OpenAI, from Anthropic, and even Amazon Bedrock, which we'll get into a little bit later. But for right now, we'll just use GPT-4o, and we'll go from there. So we have this summarize listing query, and we basically now need to run it when we've uploaded a new PDF. So we can save this. And what we can say is, because we're using the data from our parse PDF query inside of this query, we only want to run it when manually, first of all, and we only want to run it when our parse PDF query has run successfully. So back over on our parse PDF query, queries have event handlers as well. So basically we can say when the query runs successfully, we want to trigger our summarize listing query, right? And we only want to run this when there's some data in here to be parsed, right? Just so that we make sure that, you know, our next query has enough data to actually do something useful with it. So I want to make sure there's actually data that's been parsed from this query, and then it will hopefully generate a listing summary for us. So if we save all of this and then we clear out our file input and go and upload it again, we should hopefully see this parse PDF query runs, and then our summarize listing query, you can see that's currently running as well. And so now that that's run, the last thing we need to do is just in our text input, we say, hey, we now want the summarized listing, the output of that query, to live in here. And so now you can see it's a little bit wordy, but we have a kind of 2-paragraph summary about our property, right? We have some of the key statistics here. We have the price, we have bedrooms, bathrooms, all that sort of stuff. And then this paragraph is a little more kind of paints a picture of some of the images that are there. So pretty quickly, we've basically built a tool that can parse a PDF and can have a listing summary. But how else can we use this data? What if the information that we're especially curious about isn't in the listing summary because the LLM decided that it wasn't super relevant? It's buried 3 or 4 pages down in the PDF. How do we handle that sort of thing? And so what we can do is we can actually use a chat component. So if you've used ChatGPT or Anthropic's Claude or something similar, you're very familiar with this kind of chat interface. And what we're going to basically do is give it all of the data from our PDF as context, and then that will allow us to interact with all of that and decide, we can ask additional questions about it or anything like that. So let's go ahead and do that. So in our system prompt, we're going to say you are a helpful assistant who is knowledgeable about real estate and can answer questions about a listing given the listing details. So this just gives it a little more information about what we want it to do. And this is also where we're going to provide the model with our context. So we don't want to pass all of the listing details to the model with every single chat message. So what we can do is we can give the listing details here in the system prompts that it has that context, but it won't use up our context window and make us spend more money than we need to by sending those results in every message, right? So now we've got that in there. We can see again in the preview that it has all of our listing information in here. And so let's just see how this goes, right? So we want to just give us a little more space here. So it should have all of that context now because our PDF has already been uploaded and run. So we should be able to say, for example, we can ask it like basic facts, like how many square feet is this property? And again, it should take this context that we fed it about the listing, and it should be able to give us an answer, right? So again, it says 17,545 square feet, which we can just kind of double check against the summary over here to see that that's correct. It basically pulled this sentence almost verbatim from the context we gave it. So we could ask it something else that's probably in the listing that I don't think is in the summary is like, what is the cost per square foot? And again, it won't do that math for us, but if it's in the listing somewhere, it will do that. So it tells us here it's $11,114, and it even gives us a little bit of insight into how that's calculated. Again, it's not doing that math for us in real time, but if that's somewhere in the listing, it will give that to you. So this is kind of a pretty useful setup for extracting this sort of information from these documents. You can do a lot of things that would maybe be helpful to deploy this to kind of a more real world scenario that's not just us. Like, for example, if you don't have a PDF uploaded here, you might want to use this appearance hidden attribute over here for this component to not have the chat component visible, because obviously if there's no PDF uploaded, there's nothing for a user to chat with. So there's a lot more that you could do and take this a little bit further to make this a productionized application. But you can see very quickly we have our PDF parsed, and we have a couple different calls to large language models that use our LLM integration. So we mentioned Amazon Bedrock a little bit earlier, and basically this is a way that inside of Retool you can get access to even more different kinds of large language models. So you can see if we scroll down, we have Meta's Llama 2, Llama 3. You can access the various Claude models in here as well as Amazon's own Titan model and a few different others. Anything you have kind of configured through your Bedrock account, you can use right inside of Retool. And we'll just do a really quick kind of demo to see how this actually works and how it's different than maybe our OpenAI integration here. So we'll leave this chat up here, and just so we can remember which is which, we'll just call this OpenAI. And what we'll do is we'll go ahead and grab another chat component, bring it down here right underneath, and we will reuse our system prompt because I think that worked out pretty well. So we'll reuse our system prompt, tell it it's a helpful real estate assistant. But in this case, we want to, let's say, bring in Llama 3 as our model. So we'll save this query. And now, because it has that same context, we can actually look at the difference between these chats in parallel. So asking it about, basic facts from the PDF is kind of interesting, but, these are kind of things you could just do a basic find in the PDF and probably find. What's cool about using large language models is you can take existing information and transform it into a bit of a different context. So what I might say here is, imagine I'm the real estate agent selling this property. Please create a first draft for an announcement of an open house next weekend. Right? So this is all the information that you would need to craft this announcement is probably in the listing. But you can use kind of the LLM's knowledge of, what makes a good, listing like this, et cetera, to bring that information into a more helpful context. So you can see it starts generating a little bit, and then it basically spits out all of this context. In this case, it actually it looks like pulled the name of the real agent from the listing and kind of pre-populated that there. So if this was you, that would already be done for you as well. But you can see it has a lot of information about amenities, and it has, already kind of picked a date and time for you. It has the location pre-populated, all of this stuff. And so this is a really good start to kind of use something like this in the real world. Obviously, you'd probably want to take a pass at it as a real person, but there's a lot here that's helpful for something you might want to include. And so something that's kind of interesting is this is the OpenAI kind of GPT 4.0 interpretation of this request. Now that we have this Bedrock model hooked up to Llama 3, we can actually ask it the same question. So imagine I'm a real estate agent. Property, please create a first draft. Right, so we should see, looks like maybe that's not fully working here. Cool, let's try a different model here and see what we get. So like I said, all of these models here are kind of accessible at any time. So we could also kind of compare 4.0 to the older version of GPT 3.5. So let's look at that and see what we get. So we want the same thing. All right, make it a little bit shorter there. So here you can start to see a little bit of the differences. It didn't have as big of a headline here. It uses more emoji, and so again, this is GPT 4.0 up at the top and GPT 3.5, which is the older model down below. And so one of the things I really like doing inside of my Retool apps is just looking at kind of the output of different models, because some of the different models are good at different things, and so comparing them in this way is super helpful. Just to be able to see kind of, which features do you like from 4.0, or which, can you get away with 3.5. Obviously, some models are less expensive than others. And so as you're building apps for others to use, you want to keep that in mind too, is a less expensive model giving you good enough output to be useful and that sort of thing. So, but yeah, pretty cool. I wouldn't suggest copy pasting this onto a postcard right away, but it's a pretty good start. And it pulls all the information from that PDF that we just dropped in here and let our large language models parse. So that's one of the ways you can use large language models inside of our Retool app builder. But building apps is not the only thing you can do inside of Retool. So we're also going to take a look at how large language models factor into our workflows product. So for some context, workflows are basically a feature of Retool that lets you kind of create step-by-step workflows, as the name implies, to do certain things, whether that's, responding to an API request or any sort of thing that you might want to do that doesn't need an app interface per se, but just kind of runs more on the back end. And so in this example, we have created a very basic contact form. And we have said that contact form will store its results inside of this Retool database table. Retool DB is, again, a database product that comes bundled with Retool. You get a fully functional Postgres database associated with your account, and you can use that inside any of your apps or your workflows or to store form data or really anything that you want to do inside of Retool. So we're going to be taking advantage of that. Our form, when we submit it, will push our submission into our Retool database, but then it will also trigger this workflow. So inside of this workflow, as anybody who's ever put a contact form up on a website knows, there's a ton of spam that comes through. There's a ton of people not actually contacting you about something relevant or just trying to sell you something or things like that. And so we want to make this form a bit more resilient so that anybody who is kind of reviewing the results here in Retool DB has this column here is spam. And so if there's a green check there, that will say that, our large language model decided that this response was likely spam and can let people filter through it. So this segment is a little bit more of cooking show style, given that some of this stuff is already prepared, but we'll walk through kind of what we have. So the key components here, we have the form set up, we have the database set up to store the form fields, and then we have the workflow that's going to respond to our form submissions. So because the form is already connected to the database, we can kind of set that to the side for now, and we can really focus on our workflow. So the way this is currently set up is that we have our form set up to trigger our contact us workflow whenever it's submitted. And you can see here, it basically passes the feedback and full name parameters that are like the values of these form fields into the workflow as JSON. So we've kind of set that up here as just our test JSON parameters, just so like while we're building this workflow, we don't have to keep submitting the form. We can just hard code some of these values in here as test values. So we have that in there, and that's going to take the incoming information from the webhook. The next thing we want to do is kind of create a new block, and we're going to say we want this to run an AI action. So you'll see that this is very familiar to you if you saw what we were doing with the AI queries in the last portion. This is very similar to what we were doing there. And so again, we have a lot of the same options, and we just now need to craft our prompt. So in order to not make y'all watch me type out this whole thing, I've kind of pre-done this prompt. This is where the cooking show portion comes in. And basically what we're saying is, based on the following contact form submission data, make your best guess about whether the submission is an actual piece of feedback that should be forwarded to the team or whether it should be marked as spam. So then we give it the full name that the person submitted. We give it the feedback that they submitted. Again, those are our two form field values from here. And we say, great, do you think the response above is spam? Respond with the single lowercase word true if the response is spam, or the single lowercase word false if the response is not spam. So we can just see how this goes. We also just give it a really basic system prompt. So you are an expert at spam detection with a discerning eye for feedback that should be passed to the product team. So basically just like, hey, you know what you're talking about, like make a good decision about this. So again, we'll just use GPT-4o, but just like in the last demo, all of the different models that you have in your Retool account are able to be used here as well. So you can kind of experiment with those. But let's just take a look at this, right? So I have provided the feedback. Are you interested in a list of marketing leads for the low price of $99.99 and the full name of John Doe, which could be someone's real name, but is not very likely. And so both these pieces of information, the large language model will take into account when it's trying to make this determination. So up here in the top right corner, you should be able to, let's see. Let's thinking about it. Cool. So you can see that you can run your entire workflow here in the top right, but you also notice that there are these play buttons on the individual steps of a workflow. So in this case, this allows us to, while we're building our workflow, just run one step at a time without having to run the entire workflow. So in this case, we have our hard-coded test parameters here, and we're just going to run our LLM step and see what happens. So in this case, it did exactly what we asked. It outputs the single lowercase string of true. And so it's saying that, yes, this is likely spam. If you're interested in doing this, and something that I did while I was developing this kind of prompt is you can ask it to be a little more explicit about why it thinks a particular response is spam. And so when I tested it with this response, it said, well, it flagged that the name John Doe was like commonly used in spam responses. It noted that like someone was trying to sell us something instead of provide us feedback, which is the nature of the form that we built, et cetera. So it's pretty powerful in terms of, that having that logic. But what we really want is just a single word output so that we can, in our next step, update our database to basically mark the response as spam or not. So like I mentioned, when someone submits a Retool form, that information is stored in the associated Retool database table, right? So we just have a basic contact us table with fields like we already saw mapped to the fields of the form. So just to show how this works, actually, we can hit update on this and we can go to the kind of front end of this form. And I'll submit some real feedback because I truly do think that Retool forms are awesome. So I will say as much here. And when I submit that, I get a little confetti. And if I bump over to my Retool database, I can see that, okay, now my feedback is being tracked in here. The one thing that's not fully corrected is this is spam column because we haven't finished our workflow setup. But we can see that our Retool form data is now stored in our database. So let's do the next step here. Let's drag out another Retool block. This is going to be a resource query because we want to interact with our Retool database. So we can do that. It gives us, it tells us, hey, here's all the information that's incoming from other steps in the workflow. So again, with our same double curly brace syntax that we saw in our app builder, we can reference any of the information from any of the previous steps of the workflow in this step, which is very cool. So again, because I'm sure no one here wants to watch me write database queries, I've pre-written this for us. Basically, what this says is, hey, we want to update the contact us table, which is the name of this table over here in RetoolDB. We want to update that. We want to set the spam column to isspam.data, which is noting here is not a defined workflow step. So isspam.data, right? So it's going to update that with that true or false value, which we can see down here in the input. And just to make sure we're updating the correct record, we're just checking where the full name equals the full name that was coming from the form, and where the feedback is the feedback that's coming from the form. There are more elegant ways to do this for sure if you want to have things like a hidden ID that represents every response, etc. But for our use case here, this will be good enough just to kind of make sure that we're updating the right record. So cool. Again, if we see, each of these, like hovering over each of these will give us kind of a preview of what it will be updating. And so this is not an entry that exists in our database right now, so we can't run this step on its own. But if we deploy this workflow and then go back to our form, we can actually try to run this workflow and see what happens here. So we're going to go with John Doe for the name. We're going to go and grab our spam feedback response, and we're going to hit submit. So we can see here, if you're over in your workflow, there's a little button down here at the bottom that says Run History, and you can actually see, where these have run. You might need to hit refresh, but you can see here that this just ran just now, and had, you can inspect all the data, and so this is the data that came in from the Retool form. Our is spam returned true, and then it ran this database query to update our data. And if we go over to our Retool database, we can see that actually, yes, this John Doe response is marked as spam. So if you were somebody who was kind of responsible for filtering through all these responses and you just wanted to take a quick first pass, what you could do is go up here and you could say filter is spam equal to false. And at that point, then all the responses that are marked as spam come out of this table. They're not actually gone. You can see up here, it still says 2 records, but they're not visible for you, right? So you can focus on the responses that the LLM has flagged as being not spam. The one kind of caveat to that is this is not a foolproof system by any means. Large language models are fallible. And so you definitely still want to, like any spam filter, kind of give this a skim to make sure that, nothing got too aggressively flagged. But if you have a lot of responses that you can test this on, you should be able to get, a prompt and a tuning to your large language model that is pretty accurate. So let's just make sure that It's not overly aggressive in the spam department. If I go back here and I drop this in again, we should be able to submit this. We jump over to Retool database, and we see that, again, it marked me as not spam because it interpreted this as actual helpful feedback about Retool and Retool forms. So even outside of just building apps and using chatbots with your own data, you can build super powerful workflows inside of Retool that take anything from forms or incoming API data, webhook data, anything else, and use the AI actions right inside of Retool Workflows to add AI into workflows that maybe you need some help automating, which is really cool. So I think that is kind of what we wanted to show today. We gave a couple examples, and hopefully folks have some questions. So I think we will go through those at the moment. I'm going to throw up this page. If you want to learn more about our AI tools and kind of what we have available, it's retool.com/products/AI. And that will be kind of a place for you to go and figure out what you want to do. It will show you this is some of the workflow stuff we looked at, and give you a really good overview of what you can do with AI and Retool. Cool. So we have a couple questions that have come in here. This one from Max. What is the best way to connect custom assistants from the OpenAI API with a chat component? So OpenAI has this technology called assistants. For folks that don't know, where basically you can provide the generic kind of GPT-4, GPT 3.5 large language model with some built-in context and things. And that's really helpful for if you want to kind of have an API that you can call to answer a specific kind of question. At the moment, I don't believe we have a native integration with assistants, but you can call any REST API endpoint from within Retool. And so what I would probably suggest there is basically making just a REST API call to your custom assistant, and then handling that output inside your Retool application. Cool. Asked by Sean and Kareem, why not use generate summary instead of generate text? Yeah, good question. So if we go back to the our real estate listing helper here. So in listing summary, I think the question is here, why did we use generate text when summarized text was also an option? I think that's just mostly personal preference. Because I gave it a fair bit of like other information about what I wanted to generate, etc. I chose the generate text option. But again, this is something that's very easy to test. And you can see like if we do summarize text and hit save, we can like upload it again and just see how that's different. Looks like it had some sort of error there, so we'd probably need to dig into this. Oh, because we didn't. It cleared out our instruction prompt here. Right, so then we can just run this and see how it differs. It noted that we didn't actually provide it the listing data, so let's do that real quick. Yeah, so I think the difference here is like this is a very like textbook summary as opposed to when we use generate text, it gave us a lot more kind of editorializing. It like created its own kind of mini listing for it. So I think that really just depends on like what you're looking for from your output, and obviously like trying both options and seeing which one better fits what you would like is the way to go here. This is obviously much shorter, so if you were kind of constrained for space, that might be a better option. Scott asked if we have our own on-prem AI model, how do we reference that model? If we use on-prem, are documents and data kept on-prem too? That's a good question. I think we're still definitely expanding support for models that aren't from one of the major inference providers or through Bedrock. So that's something I will have to do a little digging on and follow up with you. I'll make sure to post that in the community post that I mentioned earlier. But yes, Retool has a ton of different options for kind of self-hosting, keeping things on-prem. And, we have customers that are in all sorts of like financial services and HIPAA compliant industries that sort of stuff is super important. So we're definitely always keeping that in mind. But for that specific question, I will have to ask some folks and get back to you on that. But good question. David asked, is it possible to have two text or drop zones and ask the LLMs to compare the two documents uploaded? Absolutely. So again, like we just hooked this drop zone up to this summary and hooked up to this chat. You can, in your chat queries, like provide any sort of context you want. So in this kind of system prompt, you could say, you are a helpful real estate agent who gives people advice on choosing between two of their dream properties. And you could, as long as all of the data that was passed in was in the correct spots, and the large language model had enough context for each of those properties, then that would work exactly the same. So yeah, the one thing about all of these components and queries in Retool is that they are very flexible. So you can do most anything. They're not really restricted to one specific use case. You kind of compose them and combine them as you like. So by Michael, for the OpenAI models, is the API key required? Yeah, so someone shared a docs link in the chat. Definitely the most straightforward way to use Retool AI is to provide API keys for the model provider of your choice. But yeah, I think we're maybe making an update to including some AI inference on some of our paid plans. So those docs are definitely where to be on the lookout for that sort of thing. That will be the most up-to-date resource for that. Okay, can the input for the listing summary be dynamic as user input? Not really sure what you're asking here, but basically, yeah, because this is just a text field, we can use this double curly brace syntax to reference any of the other components. So for example, like if you didn't want to reference the parsed PDF and you wanted to reference like a text box that you let a user paste text into, you could definitely do that. You would just need to reference inside of our summarize query, instead of referencing the parsed PDF data, we would want to reference the text box data. So that goes back to the fact that all of the components and queries inside of Retool have access to outputs of all of the other components and queries inside of Retool using that double curly brace syntax. Is there a way to determine the workflow based on the user input using Gen AI? Good question. I think again, like you can kind of construct these components in any way that you want to. We kind of had an example of a branch in a workflow based on like the output of an LLM here. So like the difficulty there is always, LLMs sometimes struggle with a very specific output format. That's why we were very specific here we wanted a single, lowercase true or false. So if you're trying to be a little bit more dynamic with how you're controlling other components and workflows based on the output of large language models, that would be the one thing to keep in mind. Unlike a functioning code that always produces the same output, LLMs do have a bit of variance in them. So that's something to keep in mind. Asked by Tyler, regarding the internal vector database, is there a way to import or reference an external database? Can the use vector DB entries include both a vector search and a metadata search? Okay, some good questions here. A couple different ones. Is there a way to import or reference an external vector database? I think the easiest way to do that would probably be if that vector database provider had an API. Like I mentioned, we REST API queries are something are very common in Retool. You can query any sort of REST API or most other APIs as well, right inside of Retool. So that would probably be the easiest way to do that. We don't have a native integration for vector databases that aren't Retool vectors at the moment. That is something that we're exploring, looking at a few of the different kind of popular tools. But for now, if you want the native kind of just like check a box and get to use your vectors in an AI query, that is a Retool vectors thing. If you want to, use another vector database provider's API to pull in their data and kind of mix that in with some of the stuff that you're doing in your query, that's definitely a possibility depending on what they support. And then, yeah, can the use vector DB entries include both a vector search and a metadata search? Again, that would be kind of contingent on how you set up either Retool vectors or your external vector provider. But the Retool vectors docs would probably be the best place to go for that. And we have a bunch of different content around using vector data in apps and workflows coming out soon, hopefully. Cool. Jonathan asked, my company wants to parse very large PDFs, 50 pages plus. We're using an internal LLM leveraging 3.5 turbo, probably good for that much data. When we tried to parse a PDF, we very quickly got a token limit error. My question with Retool vectors is if we put our PDF in there, would that help? Yeah, so good question. The context windows of large language models, basically how much data you can stuff into a single request and have the language model remember what you're talking about, are constantly increasing, but definitely for large documents like that, you will run into those limits pretty frequently. We've had a couple cases of things we've been trying to build internally where that's been an issue as well. We're just trying to pass too much data to large language models. So for that, if you're using 3.5 turbo, there's definitely a lower context window on there. Some of the Claude models and GPT-4 32K have larger context limits. So that's a thing where maybe those models will obviously be a little bit more expensive, but if you can fit all of that into that context window of a larger model, and save yourself from having to do a vector database, that maybe simplifies things a little bit, but that'd be something you'd have to experiment with. With retool vectors, like putting your PDF in there, that will definitely help, because it will not be sending the entire contents of your PDF to a large language model every time. It will basically be utilizing the vector database to decide what the most relevant pieces of context are, and sending those to the language model. Now, if you're talking about, having multiple files and like trying to only pull from a single file for a single query, that gets a little bit more into like how you structure your vector database and how you set that up. But yes, that's the advantage of a vector database, is basically you don't have to pass an entire huge amount of context to the language model every time. You can use kind of how that data is stored and fetched to pass smaller amounts of context, which lets you use cheaper models, and also in a lot of cases gives you better output. Cool. Unrelated to AI, we really love to see a tighter integration with Retool forms and Retool apps, referencing your forms from a component. Yes, good call. This is a pretty common request on the community as well. So this is something I definitely know we're working towards. Again, you can reference components and queries like pretty seamlessly with each other, but bringing some of our other Retool products into the app builder and exposing apps to other Retool products is definitely something that's being worked on by the team. So thanks for that feedback. Cool. Thoughts from David. I've been waiting for a few months for AI functions to be able to work in a language other than English. As soon as there is a diacritic in the text, it goes into an error. This is also something that has been flagged to the AI team, and they're definitely working on. The multilingual support is something that we've been improving inside of Retool, just outside of the AI space, but just in the app builder as a whole. And so a lot of that work is definitely starting to get into some of our AI queries and things, so that hopefully that multilingual support will be much better in the coming weeks and months. Yeah. And then kind of a final question here. Can we touch on the vector database as well? Maybe next section. Yeah, we can definitely do a session on vector databases. There are a lot to go into for today, but essentially for folks that aren't familiar with vector databases, the idea is that you can take like text or any sort of data, and perform what's called an embedding on it, which turns it into kind of a mathematical representation of that data. And the advantage to it being mathematical instead of text is that code, large language models, etc., can much more easily determine what's relevant, what kinds of things are similar to each other. And so that's where it gets into the whole, like what pieces of context do we need to include given a user's query, and it's able to make much smarter decisions about that. So essentially a vector database is just a data storage that stores information in a specific way that's useful for things like similarity search, passing it to large language models, and a bunch of other use cases. And whereas previously you would need to have a separate sort of database that stored things in that way, Retool has what we call Retool vectors, which allows you to digitize or vectorize like things like PDFs or even web pages. So we have a vector that has all of our Retool documentation in it. So if you wanted to create a chat component that could answer Retool questions for you, that's very quickly just like a single checkbox inside of Retool and selecting our documentation vector. So things like that, it makes really easy to use that sort of information for things like large language models and other things. So yeah, I think a dedicated session on vectors would be great. I do know we have some blog content coming out about vector databases and how to use that as well. So that's some really good feedback. Awesome. Well, thanks, y'all. Thanks for hanging out. Everybody who stuck around for the full session. I hope everybody got questions answered. Again, if there's anything you either didn't want to ask live or just kind of forgot or remember an hour or two from now, head over to the community post and drop those links in there. We will post the recording there as well, so that everybody can have access to that. And I'll be hanging out there answering folks' questions. But yeah, again, thanks so much. If you want more information, retool.com/products/AI to dig into some of this AI specific stuff. And we're excited to see what you build with Retool AI.